So the Great Reform Act of 1867, which had expanded the franchise and had led to the great victory of the Liberal Party in 1868, also led to the rise of a guy called William Gladstone. So William Gladstone was the leader of the Labour Party. He became Prime Minister in 1868. And under Gladstone, what we saw was a rise of liberal reforms in Britain over the next decade. So based on this kind of growing demand for Britain to become more liberal in its politics, a number of liberal reforms were introduced. Many of them, although not all of them, many of them by the Liberal Party itself. So one of the first things that Gladstone did was try to make the British bureaucracy, the British civil service, more competitive. Traditionally, it had been a kind of an old boys network, people who had connections, who were given important government jobs. Gladstone's Liberal Party sought to reform this, to make competitive exams the basis upon which someone would get a government job. Similarly, army officer commissions traditionally were purchased, which meant that many officers in the British Army simply bought their position in the military. Under Gladstone, that is reformed to ensure that there was some level of meritocracy involved in people who became officers in the British Army. Now, when I say competitive exams were introduced for state jobs, it would be a mistake to assume that this led to a complete meritocratic system. Generally, people had to attend what were called public schools, i.e. fee-paying schools, in order to be kind of competitive for these exams. So this was still, it was more meritocratic, but still really open to the kind of upper levels of British society. Indeed, the British government itself actually expanded dramatically in this period. I mean, traditionally, compared to the rest of Europe, the British government, in terms of its size, had been relatively small. So in 1841, in Britain, there was about 45,000 people working for the government, which was much smaller than many of the other continental governments. There's a very famous story about Queen Victoria once asked, "What is bureaucracy?" because she had never heard of the word. And she was told, "Madam, that is something they have in France," i.e. the British government didn't do bureaucracy. But from that base of 45,000 in 1841, by 1911, it was over 300,000 officials working for the British government. So not only was the entry level into the British government positions becoming more competitive, the number of jobs themselves were also actually expanding. A very key reform took place in 1872, the Secret Ballot Act. Prior to 1872, all voting was done in public. You went to the hustings and you declared, "I'm voting for candidate A or B." This obviously gave enormous control to people who had tenants or had people on their land over whom they had some kind of financial clout. The picture you're looking at here on the screen basically shows a landowner showing up with his tenants and essentially exchanging their votes for cash. So the Secret Ballot Act made all voting public and ultimately broke the power of landlords to control the votes of their tenants, because they could monitor how they voted. The Elementary Act of 1870 also placed the government in charge of national education. That'd say the government saw its role as educating its population. So then this was obviously a liberal reform, but of course, in some ways, this was also to suit the ends of the government. As government bureaucracy was growing bigger and bigger, as businesses were growing bigger and bigger and needed people who had basic literacy and mathematical skills, the government essentially was creating mass education to provide for those needs. Another key reform in the franchise was extended again in 1884. And so I said we had in 1832, about 1 million men were able to vote. That had risen to 2 million in 1867. The Reform Act of 1884 increases that to 4.5 million men, which was about 40% of the adult male population. 60% of the adult male population. So still we have all women, of course, don't have a vote, and only 60% of men, but the franchise is getting broader and broader in terms of liberal demands. And the most significant reform in British politics probably comes in the early 20th century, again under the Liberal Party, where the House of Lords in the British system, its power was essentially diluted. So the British parliamentary system is the House of Commons, which is like the US House of Congress, and the House of Lords, which was the equivalent of the US Senate. Indeed, the US Senate was modelled on the House of Lords. Any law that was going to be passed had to be passed both by the House of Commons and the House of Lords. That's pretty straightforward. The problem from a democratic point of view is that the House of Lords was filled with people who owned land, who essentially were aristocrats. The only way you could be in the House of Lords was either you inherited noble title, or you were appointed to that noble title by the king. So really, in terms of Britain's liberal democratic system, it wasn't particularly democratic that an unelected body of aristocrats could decide whether a law or not would pass. But its power had survived most of the 19th century. Where it eventually caused a constitutional crisis came in beginning in 1909, when the Liberal Party wanted to introduce a budget that would provide for national insurance. In other words, they wanted to increase tax to provide insurance for workers who lost their jobs or were injured on the job or something like that. Most of these taxes were going to fall on the wealthy aristocrats. And so the House of Lords vetoed the budget. And that itself was something of a revolutionary act. The House of Lords was fully entitled to veto whatever it wanted, but it had long passed into accepted tradition that the House of Lords would not veto the budget because the budget was created by the House of Commons, an elected representative body of the people, unlike the House of Lords. So once the House of Lords used its veto to stop the national insurance budget, what became known as the People's Budget, this created a constitutional crisis, and people wanted the House of Lords to be reformed and have its power taken away. The problem, of course, was in order for the House of Lords to lose its power, the House of Lords would have to vote to accept its own diminution of power, which seemed unlikely. The deadlock was finally broken in 1910 when the new king, George V, basically sided with the Liberals and said that if the Conservative Party, or if the House of Lords, which was mostly made up of conservative aristocrats, refused to pass a law reducing its own power, then he would appoint new people to the House of Lords to create a majority in which to do so. Because as king, he could make anyone a member of the House of Lords whoever he wished, and therefore he could get the votes to win the vote in the House of Lords that way. So the House of Lords conceded, and it lost its veto. In its place, at the time it was introduced, and today the House of Lords' power is even further reduced, but in 1911, what was changed was the House of Lords retained the veto, but the veto only lasted for 2 years. So if you introduced a law in 1912 and the House of Lords did not want to pass it, it could delay it until 1914, and after then, it became law. And that's exactly what happened actually in one of the most significant political issues of the day in Britain. So where the United Kingdom had its greatest difficulty in promoting a liberal politics was to do with actually Ireland. Ireland had been a British colony for a long, long time. It was formally incorporated into the United Kingdom in 1801. So in theory, it was part of the United Kingdom, no different from England or Scotland. And we talked about this when we mentioned the famine. But over the course of the 19th century, Ireland actually used to have its own parliament while it was a British colony. That parliament was taken away when Ireland was formally incorporated into the United Kingdom in 1801. But over the course of the 19th century, as Ireland remained a very poor, economically stagnant society, many Irish politicians felt that an Irish parliament would be very useful for fixing Ireland's problems. The famine in particular of the 1840s was highlighted as a very good example of how British mismanagement had catastrophic consequences for the people of Ireland. One of the most obvious examples of this was a guy called Isaac Butt. Butt had been a very strong defender of Ireland's position within the United Kingdom. So Butt was an Irishman. He traditionally opposed demands for an Irish parliament. He felt that Ireland was part of the United Kingdom, it should stay the same. But the famine changed his mind. To Butt's view, the Irish famine demonstrated that the British government didn't really view Ireland as an integral part of the United Kingdom. He felt that the British government had abandoned Ireland during the famine, and therefore an Irish parliament was necessary. This became known as the Home Rule question. That is, Irish politicians wanted Ireland to have its own parliament, not complete independence from the United Kingdom, just a level of political autonomy, but remaining within the United Kingdom. So that was the Home Rule issue. Butt established something called the Home Rule Party, in 1873. And in many ways, the Home Rule Party was the first modern political party of the Western world. It was very, very tightly organised. Basically, if you wanted to be a member of the Home Rule Party, you had to vote exactly as you were told on any vote held in the House of Parliament. The Home Rule Party very quickly became the majority political party in Ireland. So over the course of the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, most Irish seats, most Irish votes went to the Home Rule Party by a considerable margin. But the Home Rule's demand for some level of Irish Parliament was generally ignored by the British Parliament, and so in response, the Home Rule Party began adopting obstructionist tactics. Particularly, you're familiar what filibustering a bill is. The filibustering tactic wasn't new, but what the Home Rule Party started doing was filibustering all laws that the British government tried to pass in order to stop Parliament working and to force the British government to focus on Irish issues. In one famous session in 1881, they forced the British Parliament to sit for 41 consecutive hours, and in the end the British Parliament had to change its rules to stop these tactics from working. In Ireland itself, they used boycotts. The very first boycott took place in Ireland in the 1870s when a landowner who refused to reduce his rents because his tenants couldn't afford to pay, essentially was shunned, was treated as a social pariah. No one would work his land. He was essentially boycotted, and the guy's name was Captain Boycott. That's where the name boycott comes from. And Boycott was forced to sell his land and leave Ireland. And an example of the kind of, pacifist yet confrontational tactics adopted by those who were trying to promote an Irish Parliament, most specifically, and reform of Irish land crisis more generally. So the British Liberal Party was sympathetic to the Irish Home Rule cause. Under William Gladstone, twice they tried to pass a Home Rule law in 1886 and again in 1893, but they failed due to bitter opposition, not just from the Conservative Party, but actually some Liberals also felt that giving a parliament to Ireland was simply unacceptable. In particular, what they were afraid of was that Ireland, a majority Catholic country, would suppress or would use its parliament to oppress the Protestant minority that lived in Ireland. And this is really a good example, the Irish question, of how Britain's liberal tendencies and its nationalist tendencies kind of clashed. Basically, a lot of people in Britain respected the fact that a clear majority of people in Ireland supported Home Rule and felt that that demand should be given. Yet other people felt that, well, Ireland is an integral part of the United Kingdom. It did not have the right to separate itself in any way politically from the rest of Britain, and therefore needed to be kept in the exact same political position that it was. The Home Rule Bill was not actually passed in Ireland until 1912, and it was only passed in 1912 because the House of Lords had traditionally vetoed all efforts to introduce Home Rule. Because it lost its own veto power the previous year, it was granted in 1912. It was due to come into law in 1914, but it actually led to a political crisis in Ireland where some people, a minority of people called Unionists, wanted to prevent an Irish Parliament, wanted to remain part of the United Kingdom. Most of them tended to be Protestant. Most of them were afraid of what would happen if a Catholic Parliament Catholic Parliament, as they saw it, was introduced. And as the date to introduce the bill was approaching in 1914, it appeared that a civil war would break out in Ireland because both sides were starting to arm themselves and create large armed militias. It was the intervention of the First World War that prevented the Home Rule Bill being immediately introduced. And ultimately what happened was, during the course of the First World War, and a rebellion broke out in Ireland that eventually led to Ireland actually becoming, or at least the 26 of the 32 Irish counties, becoming politically independent from the United Kingdom after the First World War.